All right, step one is to take off the engine cover. And it lifts up real easy, but you have to also pull it towards you a bit. One of the engine cover posts were loose, so I had to tighten that up. Next, you see me evaluating what brackets and hoses do I need to disconnect. Some of the tutorials that I watched had them taking the battery out, taking the air filter box out, and all sorts of things that just are going to be parts you can lose later on. So I was trying to be very careful at the beginning, trying to take out the minimum amount of components, disconnecting the minimum amount of hoses. So here, there's just no way around it. You've got to get this three-way adapter that connects the throttle body sensor with the air box and this other sensor. You got to get that out of the way. And then you need that out of the way so that you can get to the 4 bolts that hold on, I guess that's the throttle butterfly slash mass airflow sensor combined unit. So here I am. I'm just, before I start digging into that, I'm looking at all of the other hoses that are attached to that plastic intake plenum, and I'm just going up there with some needle nose pliers with serrated tips, which grips the hose clamps real well. Fortunately, all of the small hoses use those spring type ones, and the tabs are oriented that made them pretty quick to disconnect. There's really not a lot of videos on how to replace the starter on a Titan. I really only found one that showed the whole process, and he made it seem like it was very difficult. And this is a difficult project, but not for the reasons that you may think. So here I am. I've got I think this is an 8mm socket on a 6-inch extension, and I'm just pulling out 4 of these long bolts that hold on the throttle butterfly to the intake plenum. All right. I had just gotten done driving home, so the engine was still very hot in places, and so I put on a glove as I find new places to burn myself on this engine. I'm going around here, and I've cleared enough hoses out of the way, and now I'm reaching up and I'm undoing, which is, I think, 14 bolts that hold this giant plastic intake plenum in place. And so you just have to work your way around. I've got these extra long needle nose pliers that I use kind of like surgical forceps that reach down in between the wires and the hoses to pull the bolts out once I have them loosened. One of the articles that I read about how to do this procedure made it seem like this was the hard part. For me, this was not very difficult. It was a little time consuming, but as long as you're careful with your socket extension, not to drop it down in the engine bay like I did, it really isn't difficult to do. You just have to be careful, snake your socket extension down to where you need it, and once you have the bolt loose, you've got to reach in there with your extra long needle nose pliers and extract it like you're playing a very expensive game of Operation. Even though it's daylight's out, there's just so much black plastic underneath this engine cowl that even at 4:30 in the afternoon, there's not a lot of light to work under this engine bay. All right, and then once you get those bolts loose and you have the hoses disconnected, the plenum comes right out. So anytime I have big gaping holes into my engine, I don't want dust, debris, washers, loose bolts, things like that getting down in there. So I'm trying to tape it up. Blue tape is not ideal, but it's what I had on hand. Later on I used metallic tape because it seemed like it was sticking better. Yeah, there is so much plastic and aluminum on this truck that it was very difficult for me to find a place to mount my magnetic attachment for the GoPro. All right, so one of the things that added time to my repair was looking at this nest of some sort. I don't know when this happened, but it must have happened, I guess, in the last 2 or 3 years. Some animal decided that the V of this engine was a great place to make a home. I didn't see any obvious chew marks on anything else, but I also don't have the best visibility into this engine bay. So it took me a while to figure out
Getting how hard it is to reach back
how I was going to clean all of that out.
Way back.
There, here you can see that that's the starter right there, way in the back. I have the towel down so that I don't burn myself or cut myself on any parts of the engine bay. For context, I'm 6'2". I have a 75-inch arm span, and this is pretty much the rest of the video. There's just no way I could figure out how to reach the bolts. And not only are the starter mounted all the way up against the firewall, the bolts come in from the firewall side. So you have to reach past the starter to get anything on them. All right, so it took me about 30 minutes from popping the hood to getting access to the starter. And I had seen so many articles, and I even saw a few videos that said, oh, it'll take an expert 3 hours to change out this starter. And so I was actually feeling really good about the repair up until this point. And then I realized that there are giant studs holding this starter on, and both of them were seized in place. All right, so I accidentally arc flashed myself. I did not undo the battery terminal. Here I am going to undo the battery terminal now and disconnect that so that the next time my wrench bridges the gap on the starter terminals, I don't shoot sparks into my face. So I thought, okay, well, there's this bus bar that goes from the back to the front of the starter. I'll take that off and maybe it'll give me better access. But the fact of the matter is those bolts were seized on tight.
That's where the 10 mil is down there too. Well, okie dokie.
This engine bay doesn't suffer fools lightly. Earlier in the repair process, my 1/4-inch drive 10mm socket was knocked off the end of an extension by a hose. And I could see it, but I couldn't reach it. Way back on top of the transmission tunnel, far away from where I could reach it, but I could just see it with my headlamp on. That tapping is the sound of a 16-ounce hammer hitting a 8-inch 14mm wrench. It was an open-ended wrench because that's all the space you have. You can't fit a socket on it. Even though I pushed and moved hoses and wiring harness around, there's just not enough space to get a long pry bar back there on a socket. And so I took the open-ended wrench and I hit it with a hammer. And I hit it with a hammer some more. And it wasn't enough. So here I'm using a 4-pound sledgehammer. And I'm just, as best I can, with about a 12-inch stroke, maybe not even that much, and I'm beating on this wrench to try and break it loose. If this bolt had better access, I could put an impact on it or something else and zip it right out. The bolts that hold it in this starter in place are comparable in size to the threads that go on the lugs. So as everybody does when they are out of ideas, I checked YouTube for some inspiration on maybe somebody had a trick or something to get back there and bust these bolts loose. But no doing it. There's maybe 1/2 inch of clearance between the head of the bolt and the firewall. And I just didn't have a tool. I didn't have an articulated headed wrench or some sort of breaker bar that had the articulation required to get back there. So I just used a wrench and a jackhammer to try and bust the nut loose. Look, I'm no professional mechanic, but I've been wrenching on my own cars for about 25 years. I'm in fairly decent shape and pretty active for a 41-year-old. I can still do a few pull-ups and do about 40 push-ups in one set. And I just did not have the strength with the room that I had to bust these nuts loose. There's only two of them holding them on, but I'm guessing they're between 80 and 120 foot-pounds, and they are way back up against the firewall with horrible access. And so the purpose of this video is really to dissuade you from doing it. Spoiler alert, I don't ever get these bolts out. I break one loose and am able to back it out, but the other one is seized in place. So I ended up laying on my stomach for about 15 minutes and very carefully going at it with a Dremel tool and about 3 cutoff wheels to cut the head of the bolt off so that I could finally get this starter motor out. And I had to basically go by sight. If I didn't see sparks, I knew I was cutting aluminum, which was part of the casting. And if I did see sparks, then I knew I was cutting the steel bolt. But I guess there wasn't enough anti-seize being put in place, and the steel and the aluminum had reacted together and just Loctited it into place. See here, it's nighttime. I'm as frustrated as ever. I've beat on it. My chest is getting sore from laying on the radiator support while I'm trying to break this nut loose. And so my advice to you is go to the dealership. Save up the $800 they're going to ask for labor on top of the $400 it's going to cost to get a Nissan branded starter in place, and just say, hey, this is $1,200, but the truck hasn't had any other mechanical issues, so $1,200 for replacement parts and 140,000 miles is definitely ahead of the curve. But yeah, the Nissan Titan is a reliable vehicle, but it is not going to be a pleasure to work on once something breaks. Look, when it comes down to it, there's only 3 reasons why you should do something yourself. And that's when the price is right, the quality is important, and the timeline. I couldn't get anybody that would touch my truck in the next 5 days. And I'm not sure why that is, but I needed my truck ASAP. Also, quality-wise, I've been bitten in the past, so I'm always reluctant to hire out work on my vehicles to anybody. That includes third-party specialists, dealerships, and then cost. I called around 3 separate places, and I got between $800 and $1,200 total to replace the starter in my truck. The dealership wanted about $400 for the starter and about $800 in labor, and they wanted to take a week because I guess they were in high demand. But I would say, even for an advanced mechanic, this is not going to be an easy repair. And I would recommend shade tree mechanics to stay away from it, because the chances of you getting a seized bolt with so many different materials all interacting together under the hood, and I didn't see anti-seize or Loctite or anything under there that would prevent that. So on my way out, I made sure to use anti-seize in certain locations and Loctite in others, so that they didn't need to be torqued, to 88 foot-pounds. So that's just something that I do. But it's also my vehicle, and I'm the mechanic, so I'm taking the risk on it. But I would say in general, save up
let somebody else work on this for this job. It's just such a pain in the butt.